Recent outrage over allegations of Russian agents interfering in the American democratic process should be bringing up questions about the moral implications of foreign powers involving themselves in the internal politics of a sovereign nation. After all, this is precisely what the Democrats in the United States are accusing Russia of doing, stating that Russia should be punished for its intrusion in the elections, an act considered to be a direct attack on the democracy of the country. Indeed, colluding with the campaign of any candidate during an election in hopes of damaging the chances of other candidates would be undemocratic and criminal, an ethical red flag by current international political standards. However, such standards are clearly only applied and observed when seen fit by those who call the shots in the international arena. Unsurprisingly, when the finger is pointed to Russia, regardless of the accuracy of existing evidence, the free world cries out in outrage and condemns the Kremlin's involvement in a foreign election. And yet, an eerie silence falls over Western observers when it is the United States that engages in similar acts. In fact, statistically, the United States consistently outperforms Russia, or any other nation for that matter, when it comes to election interference or even regime change. It does not take much research to stumble upon the mounds of historical examples in which the United States covertly or overtly meddled in the internal affairs of other sovereign entities. Since the beginning of the Cold War, the United States has interfered in 81 elections, while its longtime enemy, Russia, and the USSR, has interfered in 36. In recent years, the NSA has expanded its surveillance to foreign subjects, keeping tabs on 35 world leaders, some of whom are considered to be close allies of the United States. But for a country whose national security agency is legally authorized by the national legislative body to spy on 193 sovereign nations, this is to be expected. By any international code, official or unspoken, American agents and politicians have violated the sovereignties and democratic processes of a wide array of countries. Virtually no nation on Earth has been left untouched by American interference, a simple fact supported by decades of historical events. It would probably take several volumes of detailed research and a comprehensive compilation of documents to cover the known instances of US involvement in the affairs of other nations. In Asia, the United States had expressed strategic interest well before the Cold War, especially in the Middle East, a region that has historically been rich with natural resources and major trade hubs. During the Cold War, the stakes were raised as political and economic power passed from the British Empire to the United States. With the rise of the Soviet Union on the Eurasian continent, the United States stepped up its involvement to secure its interests. One classic example of a nation frequently plagued by American interference is Iran. In 1953, the popular Prime Minister Mossadegh was overthrown with the help of the CIA and its British counterparts. In his place, American agents installed Mohammad Reza Shah, a pro-American dictator known for political repression and his vice-like military grip of the country. The Shah's reign lasted for several decades until it was finally toppled by dissenting Iranian citizens. Following the period after the Shah's demise, during which Ayatollah Khomeini took power, the United States frequently engaged in the meddling of Iran's internal affairs, launching both covert and overt operations, ranging from espionage to full military intervention on numerous occasions. For the better part of the 20th century, the United States has deliberately shaped the political and economic landscape of Iran. Similar policies were applied to Iraq, though the US had a somewhat ambiguous policy with the oil-rich Middle Eastern nation. For a number of decades, the US either extended or withdrew its support for Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. The United States finally toppled Saddam's regime after falsely accusing the dictator of possessing weapons of mass destruction, despite Iraqi claims that they had long abandoned their nuclear weapon development projects of the 90s. Since then, the United States has engaged in several armed conflicts in Iraq, resulting in the casualties of hundreds of thousands of lives by conservative estimates. It is also no secret that the United States has had a long-standing policy of political and military control over Afghanistan, dating back to its support of the Mujahideen, the guerrilla force composed of many Islamic radicals fighting against the Soviet army in the 80s. Those same guerrilla fighters, supported by the United States via Pakistan, where the US also had considerable influence, went on to form such organizations as Al-Qaeda. In another region of the world, the United States has also had a long history of invasion and political interference. There is the Philippines, which was nothing short of a US colony, with American governor-generals controlling the country in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This was followed by a period of near occupation during which the United States had extensive military presence in the Philippines. Using the guise of the containment of communism, the United States invaded and destroyed the nation of Vietnam, which had just broken free from French control. Estimates of total Vietnamese casualties over the course of the war were as high as 3.9 million killed. American bombing operations included more than just the conventional bombing material, with various chemicals being used by the millions of tons on vegetation and human targets, causing serious agricultural devastation and creating many long-term medical problems for millions of Vietnamese. The war in Vietnam also spilled over to its neighbor, Cambodia, where around 500,000 tons of explosives were dropped between 1965 and 1973 by the United States. Anywhere between 50,000 to 150,000 people were killed during this period as a result of US bombings. The US supported the infamously bloody Pol Pot regime, which would not have seized control of the country without the US efforts to destabilize the existing neutral government in the 60s and 70s. Even after the Khmer Rouge was deposed by the Vietnamese, the United States continued to give support to the guerrilla resistance. In Indonesia, the CIA was involved in an attempted coup in 1958, which sought to remove the nationalist leader Sukarno. The CIA also played a role in the massacre of at least 1 million Indonesians, who were associated with the Indonesian Communist Party, effectively decimating the leftist movement in the country. Apart from these examples, entire books could be written about the United States' involvement in the Korean Peninsula and a number of other countries on the Asian continent. Asia's neighbor to the west, Africa, has also experienced its fair share of democracy. From 1981 to 1982, the US provided support to Hissène Habré after helping him topple a pro-Libyan leader. Habré has recently been accused of major human rights violations, including torture and ethnic cleansing, among other crimes. During his rule, he received consistent support from the CIA. In 2011, the United States decided to remove Muammar Gaddafi, who had long been a thorn in America's side in the North African region. Under the guise of humanitarian aid, an American-led coalition supported the anti-government rebels and staged a coup, deposing Gaddafi and effectively lying about their military objectives in the country. The US provided support to the rebels and conducted strikes against the Libyan military, as well as delivering a fatal blow to fleeing forces, resulting in the capture and public execution of Gaddafi. Media coverage failed to bring to light the fact that during Gaddafi's rule, Libya went from being one of the poorest nations in Africa to being the wealthiest, boasting the highest GDP per capita and life expectancy on the continent. Thanks to the US-led humanitarian intervention, Libya is now in complete disarray, overrun by militia fighters with its economy on its knees. The CIA was also most likely involved in the assassination of the Democratic Republic of Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, Lumumba. But even before that, the United States attempted to put in place a pro-Western government. The United States led a campaign against Lumumba's successor, who was subsequently exiled from the Congo. Joseph Mobutu, a Congolese military dictator who controlled the country from 1965 to 1997, known for human rights violations, high degrees of corruption, and oppression of political rights, enjoyed extensive support from the United States. Then there is the region that has perhaps struggled the most with the long history of US imperialism and dominance, Latin America. There's the US-backed conservative-led coup against a democratically elected João Goulart, which removed from power the potential leftist threat with efficiency, installing a military regime which had ties to the United States. Panama was the subject of US invasion in 1989, hardly a shock for a country that for a large portion of the 19th and 20th centuries was under the control of US companies. Nicaragua, which was occupied by the US between 1912 and 1933, was rocked by a series of bloody conflicts in the second half of the 20th century. During this time of unrest, the United States famously trained and armed Contra commandos, who were the right-wing counterparts to the left-leaning Sandinista forces. Nicaragua's Caribbean neighbor, Cuba, suffered US military occupation from 1898 to 1902, then again from 1906 to 1909, and once more from 1917 to 1922. After finally shaking free of US control in the second half of the 20th century, Cuba remained the target of numerous US efforts to destabilize its political structure, with some 638 CIA assassination attempts on Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro. The United States has had a long-standing anti-left policy in Bolivia, in which it helped rightist military groups take control of the country by deposing mostly democratically elected and popular governments. The result of US support of such groups has been the persecution and execution of individuals associated with the leftist movements, as well as economic setbacks and political repressions. Operation PB Success orchestrated a coup in Guatemala, removing the democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz, dissolving the leftist Revolutionary Action Party, and installing a military junta, followed by a long period of military rule. Having been one of the banana republics whose natural resources were monopolized by the American-owned United Fruit Company, Guatemala was no stranger to US interference in its domestic affairs. Then, of course, there was the occupations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the latter of which saw US military intervention remove a democratically elected Juan Bosch in 1965, resulting in a bloody and oppressive regime established and supported by the United States. During the 1970s, Project Foobelt sought to prevent leftist Salvador Allende from taking office in Chile. When he narrowly won in a free and contested election, the CIA supported a military coup in replacing Allende with Augusto Pinochet, who began a reign of terror and political repression in 1973. In light of recent developments regarding Russia's involvement in the US elections, one final case of US interference should be remembered. In 1996, the United States interfered in the Russian elections. Time magazine published a documented report of how the US directly worked to turn around the election of 1996 in favor of Yeltsin, who at the time had some 6% approval and was behind in the polls compared to communist candidates like Gennady Zyuganov. It looked like Zyuganov or another leftist candidate was going to win the election by a landslide. After a disastrous period of complete economic collapse, Yeltsin was seen by a majority of Russians as an incompetent, corrupt leader who destroyed the country. The White House eagerly offered to advise Yeltsin, who was seen as the best chance to stop the return of a communist majority in the parliament. A team of specialists was sent to turn the election around. Despite being unimaginably unpopular in the public eye, thanks to the efforts of the American team working for Yeltsin's campaign, the president was re-elected. If Russia ever sent a team of specialists to manage and direct the campaign of a politician running for office in America, let alone a candidate for the presidency, the outrage would be unfathomable. The worst accusations regarding Russia's involvement in the 2016 elections limit themselves to the possible acquisition and deliberate dissemination of sensitive information that likely damaged the public appearance of a targeted candidate, which in reality pales in comparison to the thought of an entire team of Russians working on American soil as campaign managers for any political figure. While the 2016 American elections were fairly close, with or without outside interference, the Russian elections of 1996 were not. There is no doubt that what the American team did for Yeltsin in 1996 was much more serious than any advantage Trump may have received as a result of potential aid from the Kremlin. If Russia's alleged involvement in the leaking of damaging materials is to be labeled an attack on the democracy of a sovereign nation, then an entirely new word ought to be created for what the US consistently does and has done in dozens upon dozens of countries. If the appropriate punishment for the crime Russia supposedly committed is a swath of economic and political sanctions, then the world should have long embargoed the United States and cut off any diplomatic ties. US operations abroad have regularly compromised the democratic process in many countries of the world, and with 193 of all 196 nations being placed under the watchful eye of the NSA, who knows how many elections are upset by US agents every year, and how many more will face the same fate. Knowing these facts, one of two things must become true in terms of electoral or political interference. Either any foreign meddling is to be internationally denounced and appropriately punished, or it should be an accepted fact that foreign agents will always be interested in influencing and shaping the political landscape of their allies and enemies. If the former is to be true, then the United States should face a number of trials and subsequent charges for its many violations of democracy and sovereignty. The existing establishment within the United States prefers taking the route of double standards and regularly enjoys picking and choosing when it wants to uphold justice and democracy, and when certain actions can be overlooked in the name of freedom, even if it means reversing the results of democratic elections or helping military dictators crush their political opposition.